San Francisco has opened its arms to show the world that peace can be achieved. Today, the future begins with a gesture of trust on both sides.
Hey there guys, Nordic Warrior here, welcome back to my video game review series. So those of you who have been following my channel will know that recently I've been reviewing several X-Men games. In my last review we looked at X-Men Origins Wolverine, the movie license game. Today we're going to be looking at one of the most recent X-Men games, X-Men Destiny, released in 2011, developed by Silicon Knights. This might turn out to be quite a long review, since I have a lot of things to say about this game, and it's one that I have quite a few mixed feelings on. And interestingly, I find the whole backstory of the development of this game and the drama surrounding it more interesting and worth talking about than the game itself. So those of you who have been following my channel for quite a while might remember that a while back I reviewed Too Human, which was Silicon Knights' previous game from 2008. I mentioned in that review how Too Human was basically the beginning of the end for Silicon Knights, for several reasons. Not only was the game both a critical and commercial failure, but it also led to a lengthy lawsuit between Silicon Knights and Epic Games over Silicon Knights' use of the Creation Engine. So the game, which was originally planned as a trilogy, ended up costing Silicon Knights a lot of money. 3 years later, with the release of X-Men Destiny, Silicon Knights made one more attempt to save their company. Acquiring the X-Men license, I guess they hoped to rely on the existing popularity of the series to recoup the losses from the failure of Too Human and the Epic Games lawsuit. And unfortunately for Silicon Knights, just like Too Human, X-Men Destiny was a critical and commercial failure. Shortly after the release of the game, Silicon Knights closed down, making X-Men Destiny the final game to be released by them. Which is a shame because they had some talent back in the day, but I digress. So ignoring the drama surrounding the game's development, how did the game actually turn out? Was it as bad as the critics said it was, or was it a bit underrated? Let's talk about it. So the game is essentially a third-person action-adventure hack-and-slash, based very loosely on the X-Men comics. The game isn't connected to any of the X-Men movies for anybody who was wondering. It has its own original story. In this game, the X-Men are basically in a declined state. Charles Xavier is dead, and the X-Men have become mostly demoralized, with several members such as Gambit leaving the group. The X-Men are now being led by Cyclops and Emma Frost, who looks like a sleazy hooker in this game. The game begins in San Francisco, which is almost as run down as real-life San Francisco, but not quite, with a peace rally dedicated to the memory of Charles Xavier, being run by a man named Luis Reyes, who is the head of a pro-mutant military group called the Mutant Response Division.
Today is about the future. A future we have chosen to face together, human and mutant alike.
During the rally, the X-Men along with the mayor are attempting to improve relations between humans and mutants, when the event comes under attack from an unseen enemy. This enemy is believed to be Magneto, who has been on the run for a while and who some believe to be dead. The game does its best to make a terrible first impression. With this being an X-Men game, you would presumably expect to play as some of the X-Men characters. Unfortunately, this isn't the case. Now, this was a great opportunity to give us a character creator. This way we could create whatever kind of character we want, and give the game more of a roleplay experience. Well, again, unfortunately this is not the case, and instead the game gives you 3 generic playable characters to choose from, each of them incredibly boring and incredibly uninteresting. These 3 characters are Grant Alexander, who is some stereotypical high school jock, Amy Yoshida, who is some random Japanese chick, and Adrian Luca, who is a newly recruited member of an anti-mutant group called the Purifiers. Of all the three characters, Adrian Luca is the only one who has a somewhat interesting backstory, with his dad being a staunch supporter of the Purifiers, and having trained his son to carry on his values and his legacy.
We are God's true children. It is your sacred duty to protect the world from these demons. You hear me?
Yes, Dad. I hear you.
And you won't disappoint me.
No, sir.
Unfortunately though, this backstory is completely wasted, since the game barely does anything with it, but I digress. Once you've selected your character, they get caught up in the chaos of the rally attack, when they find out they are a mutant, and you get to choose between 3 superpowers. Also, I like how Adrian, being a member of the Purifiers, seems completely unfazed by the mutant reveal, and the game just seems to skim over this, and he only ever really shows mild concern.
You alright, bro? Don't touch me!
This leads to an introduction into the game's combat, and it's at this point I was having flashbacks and PTSD to my 2 Human playthrough. Yeah, the combat of this game, it's not great. The game is basically a button masher, and that's fine, but the problem is that, yeah, that's all the game is. I'd say about 80 to 90% of the game is basically mashing the attack button, fighting waves and waves and waves and waves and waves of the same generic copy and paste enemies. And the game is just so repetitive. Despite being able to pick your own superpower, whatever power you choose is still going to result in the vast majority of the combat, in the whole entire game being button mashing. After you mash your way through waves of the same faceless, nameless copy and paste Purifier enemies for a while, you get introduced into the game's dialogue and RPG elements. The game, to its credit, does have plenty of dialogue. When you reach certain areas of the game, you will run into various NPCs, some of them from the X-Men.
Why did you attack a whole squad of Purifiers? The odds were against you.
Kid, they're the ones who are doing the attacking.
And some of them from the Brotherhood.
Why are you standing still? So slow. Pay attention!
As you talk to these characters, you will learn a bit about the backstory of both factions, as well as the state that both factions are currently in. You also get to learn a bit about the overall views, opinions and ideologies of these characters, and what they think about the events of the game's story. This usually consists of the X-Men characters being pacifists and wanting to achieve peace.
I'll make an opening. I'm not picking a fight with people who think they're doing right.
Mein Freund, you must follow your conscience in this. I thank you.
And the Brotherhood characters wanting a revolution and wanting to go to war with the humans.
You want to know the best way to stop them?
Yes, please.
Beat them to death with a parked car!
Sometimes you get characters who take more of a neutral stance, such as Gambit, who has left the X-Men, and is now running his own street gang, and owns his own nightclub.
Who are they and why?
Why do they wear the masks? To answer question 1, I pay them well, they follow. That's simple. As for the second, I have my reasons. Alas, some things are best left unstated.
Gambit shows up from time to time and acts like a cool badass, but his dialogue seems to indicate that he's still a good guy. So why he's running a street gang and hanging out in a nightclub rather than helping the X-Men is beyond me, but I digress. You get to interact with various X-Men and Brotherhood members, and on occasion you will even get to fight alongside them. For example, you run into some of the more popular X-Men characters, such as Cyclops.
Quicksilver will have told Magneto by now, which means we're one step closer to a full-on human-mutant war.
And Wolverine.
Just by talking to you, I'm betraying everything that ever meant anything to me. Spitting on my father's memory.
Yeah, God's got a weird sense of humor, don't he?
And you even get to hang out with guys like Colossus and Nightcrawler. You also get to meet or fight alongside various Brotherhood members, such as Pyro, Toad, and even Juggernaut.
Nah, I'm one of the lucky ones. Never let it change me or go to my head. I'm still the same sweet guy I always was. You're starting to irritate me.
You will often get the chance to ask questions and respond in your own way, though sadly most of these conversations are very clearly scripted, and whatever dialogue you choose practically makes no difference. Some of the game's dialogue is pretty funny though, to be fair.
Well, I'm sure you don't need to suffer any fools.
Are you saying I look like I'm unreasonable?
No.
'Cause I'm not. I'm just always right is all. So don't even question it!
Another thing I found quite funny about the game is that when playing as Adrian, he spends pretty much the whole game talking about how the Purifiers are the good guys, and the whole thing is a big misunderstanding. Yet in pretty much every action he does, he hinders them, and beats the crap out of them by the 100 the entire game. It honestly makes no sense, but it is pretty funny. Yeah, the writing of this game is truly awful, but more on that stuff later. One of the main selling points of the game when it came out was the element of choice. You were basically supposed to be able to choose your own path, and play through the game's story as you see fit, choosing whether you want to be a good guy or a villain, and choosing which characters to help and which characters to side with. Unfortunately though, these choices throughout the whole game are a bit of an illusion, since no matter what you choose, the story is practically the same, and it very rarely, if ever, changes the gameplay. Most of the choices in the game basically consist of choosing X-Men or Brotherhood. So basically you'll be approached by a certain X-Men character and a certain Brotherhood character, and they will sometimes offer you a side mission to undertake. By the way, speaking of side missions, there are so many of them in this game, most of which can be accessed by going the opposite path to the one you're supposed to go for the story. Since the game is very linear, unfortunately though, these side missions are all the same. I'm not exaggerating, by the way. Every single one of them consists of fighting waves of enemies, the exact same enemies that you've been fighting the entire game, except now you have a time limit. I am not joking, the game is really that repetitive. I hope you like fighting Purifiers, because you're going to be doing it a lot, but I digress. The only slight variation to these side missions is that sometimes you will have to destroy items rather than just defeat Purifiers. But the Purifiers will still be there, and they will still attack you. You could easily just skip these side missions if you wanted to, and the game would be much shorter, and you wouldn't really miss out on much content. Back to the choices. So yeah, they will offer you side missions, which are boring, and on occasion you will come across an X-Men and Brotherhood character together, and you will have a choice for which one to help.
Well, it'd be rude not to say goodbye before we head out.
Fine. Go play fetch with the X-Men lackeys. Don't expect me to bail you out of any trouble.
Ignore him, Tovarish. He's rotten company anyway. He doesn't even know any Russian folk songs.
It's the same boring combat and the same boring levels. Copy and paste. Most of them even take place in the same area. Seriously, the game reuses areas over and over again. There are even several choices that seem to be impactful, and you would think that they would change the events of the story, but yeah, these don't make much of a difference either. It seems to me like these choices were unfinished and tacked on. At some point you will have to decide whether to join the X-Men or the Brotherhood, and decide to become a full-fledged member of either faction. And again, I keep repeating myself, this changes practically nothing, bar a few scenes and a few lines of dialogue. Man, this game feels so unfinished, but I digress. So yeah, the game has a lot of dialogue, and a lot of these kinds of choices, but there's really not much substance behind these features to speak of. The choices and dialogue are practically pointless. But speaking to the characters and learning the story is a lot more fun and interesting than fighting 100 Purifiers every few minutes. As the game progresses and you defeat enemies, you unlock experience points. These points can be used to level up your character and improve specific powers and abilities. You can also collect these items called genes. These can sometimes give you power upgrades that are based on the mutant powers of various characters of the series. You can use these to give your character some passive abilities that help with the combat and traversing the levels. You can upgrade your melee attacks, your individual powers, and you can even unlock utility powers such as super speed or the ability to fly quickly through the levels. These can be very useful. It can be fun to play around with these and see what powers and upgrades suit you. At specific points in the game, you will unlock a new aspect of your power. Some of these actually look pretty cool and pretty badass. By the end of the game, your character becomes insanely powerful, and can blow away large groups of regular enemies with ease. Speaking of enemies, I mentioned before how most of the enemies are just generic, copy and paste purifiers. Later in the game you do fight some robots, however these are few and far between, and again they all pretty much look the same. You also take on these purifiers in battlesuits, and yeah, even the robots are purifiers. On a side note, who are the purifiers exactly? What exactly is their ideology? And what is their plan? And why do they all look the same? And why is their AI so terrible? Oh yeah, did I mention the AI in this game is terrible? Some of the worst AI I've ever seen in a big budget game. Another issue with the game is the overall level design. The game is filled with copy and paste hallways, each of them filled with waves, and waves are the same enemies you've been fighting the entire game. And you fight these enemies so often, and there are so many of them, that the game literally makes you want to rage quit. Gee, what does this remind me of? There are so many reused areas in the game, so many side missions that take place in the exact same location, and so many levels that just feel like pointless filler. One method of traversing parts of the levels is that you get to do some climbing. There are certain rails and ledges that the game lets you grab onto to reach certain areas. Some of these are electrified and you will need to be careful to time them right. This does its bit to add a bit of variety to an otherwise very repetitive game. Up until this point, the game sounds pretty awful, doesn't it? It has generic repetitive combat, generic repetitive gameplay, and generic repetitive level design. And the dialogue and RPG elements that you have here just feel so tacked on and so unfinished. Another issue I had with the game was the graphics and its overall visual style and aesthetic. The graphics are mostly mediocre, and the game looks very dated for 2011. The backgrounds and textures are incredibly blurry, and the character models look so bland and unrefined. Some of the locations of the game look nice, but overall I'd call it a mixed bag. The story and writing of the game is laughable, and really makes no sense, and if truth be told, the game is just so bland. However, the game has one thing that in my opinion is a redeeming value, and that is the boss battles. The boss battles in this game are epic, really cool and badass boss battles. It seems as if pretty much all the effort and innovation from Silicon Knights went into these boss battles. For example, you have a couple of battles with Cameron Hodge in his battlesuits, and an incredible battle with Magneto and Juggernaut, and my personal favourite, a huge battle against a Sentinel. You also take on several members of the X-Men, and several members of the Brotherhood at various points of the story, culminating in a final boss against Bastion, which is pretty badass. And pretty much all the bosses are fun. So yeah, I'd say as flawed as this game is, the boss battles at very least make it worth checking out, if you're an X-Men fan. They're a lot better than the ones in Too Human at least. The game also has several bonus features. The game has quite a few collectibles to find hidden throughout the game. You have these Purifier propaganda posters all over the game that you can rip off the walls. There isn't really much of a reason to do this aside from gaining achievements, but it is what it is. I mentioned before you can find power upgrades. You can also find various files and bios of the game's characters, as well as the game's factions. These are quite fun to read. You also have several unlockable costumes to find hidden throughout the game. Some of these are unlocked by completing missions, others are unlocked by finding them. Most of these look pretty cool and most of them resemble one of the game's other characters in their visual style. Bonus features like this are always appreciated by me, and they do their bit to add replay value. Another issue I have with the game though, and it's something that I do have mixed feelings on, is the length. This game is unbelievably short for a big budget game. It's one of the shortest games I've ever played. Ignoring the boring side missions, you could probably complete this game in 4 hours, or maybe even less if you're good at the game. To be fair though, there is some replay value, since you can actually take your character with all your unlocks and upgrades, and replay the game's story. So you have a good New Game Plus mode, so that's good. and I guess it gives you an incentive to play a bit differently in the replay. But like I said before, the choices in the game don't really make much of a difference. The ending and main story events will be mostly the same, and if truth be told, the game's ending is extremely anticlimactic in my personal opinion. Speaking of the game's ending, even the credits have you fighting waves and waves of purifiers. I am not joking, the game's credits literally have you fighting purifiers. Man, Silicon Knights had some balls on them, didn't they? Speaking of which, there's a funny Easter egg / reference in this game. Years ago, back when I was achievement hunting for this game, yeah, I used to achievement hunt in games, I noticed that there is an achievement that you can unlock by failing 100 times, called Can I Get a Valkyrie? This is of course in reference to the Valkyrie cutscenes in 2 Human, that were unskippable, so you had to watch them every time you failed. I found that pretty funny. So yeah, that pretty much sums up my thoughts on X-Men Destiny. I think in retrospect, this game came out in a pretty tough time. 2011 was a great year for gaming. There were so many great games that year, and a generic button masher like this, with bare bones RPG elements, was never going to stand out much. It's not all bad. I mean, it does have some great boss battles, and some great looking costumes and spectacles. And towards the end of the game, it turns into a bit of a power fantasy, which I like in games. And it's fun to play around with different powers, but for the most part the game is just a disappointment, if truth be told. If I could use one word to describe X-Men Destiny, it would be the word generic. It's a generic button mashing hack and slash with an X-Men paint job, and it was rightfully criticised as such in my personal opinion. Thanks for watching guys. I give X-Men Destiny a generous 4 out of 10. I'd recommend it at a low price if you're an X-Men fan, or if you're just curious to check it out. Let me know what you guys think. This concludes the X-Men review series for now. Stay tuned for more retrospective video game reviews. Once again, I have a lot of reviews coming to the channel in the near future. Thanks for watching and God bless.
What did you admire him for?
His courage. His determination always to do what he thought was right, no matter what it cost him.
Then he lives on in his son.